Can anyone hear me back there? Do I need this? I need it, huh? Because, I don't know, it's like I'm in a dome right now, so it's like, I'm tripping up here. Alright. Keep it, okay. Alright, we'll go with the consensus. Welcome everyone. We're actually going to get started here fairly soon. Just quick housekeeping things, we'll get those out of the way. Does everyone have cue cards? Anyone not have cue cards? Good, because I have cue cards. So one of the best ways to actually answer your questions or get them answered as they come out through the lecture is actually to jot them down on the cue cards, and you can distribute them to some of the volunteers. And that way we'll be able to go through the go through the questions throughout the lecture, make sure that we have some of the more priority questions right there on the top, and then we can transition quite seamlessly into the actual program and into the question and answer period. So if I can actually have you, if you don't mind, just distribute cue cards and pens. I'm sorry, that's all I have. We are in a university, so I hope I'll probably find some more. How's everyone doing? Yeah? It's snowing outside. What's up with SFU Burnaby? Like this is very foreign to me. Like, I haven't seen snow in a long time, and I thought I had to go way up north to go and find snow. And all I really had to do was go 1 hour away from UBC, and there's all the snow here. But that's really cool. So nonetheless, I'm really glad everyone was able to make it out, and we're going to get started here. So Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be unto you all. Welcome to United Islam Awareness Week, day 1 of lectures, day 2 of boots. My name is Shahir, and I'm going to be your MC for tonight. We're going to be getting things underway, so like I said, I'll get a few housekeeping things out of the way here. Cue cards are the best way to get your questions answered. So throughout the lecture, as the speaker tonight goes to the topic, if something comes up, you have a question, you can just jot it down right there so you don't forget, and you can pass it over to any of the volunteers. And I'm told there is a prize that is going to be awarded, and that's going to be towards the end of the program, so make sure you stick around. If you are that winner, you don't want to be missing out, so that's going to be distributed later this evening. So let's get to it. I really want to extend a warm welcome to all of you. The United Islam Awareness Week is a very special project for Muslims, not just here in Vancouver, but as you're going to see, it's a very unique and special project for Muslims across Western Canada. It's really our chance to showcase this beautiful religion that we as Muslims truly cherish across the world. And do we have anyone who's not Muslim in this room today? All right, so you're going to find out, if you don't know already, Muslims are quite generous, okay? Like, if you were to go over to a Muslim's house, you'll find that they will really stuff you to the brim with all these exotic foods and flavors. Anyone here not try biryani? Okay, everyone's had the privilege here trying biryani. Anyone not try the shawarma? Okay, we're good. Oh, you haven't? Wait, what? Okay, some of the Muslims haven't tried shawarma, so I don't know what's going on here. Anyway, one of the things you'll realize that if you ever went to a Muslim person's house, is they're so hospitable, so generous, and they want to give as much as they can. Part of also what we love to share is the beautiful message of Islam that each and every one of us Muslims we follow, and that's something that we want to share with the wider community. So you'll find that despite many people's busy schedules, there's a tremendous set of volunteers that have been working tirelessly, hard nights and long evenings to really put this program together, and we really want to extend a very special welcome to all of our guests here, whether you're Muslim or you're non-Muslim. The goal of this project, Islam Awareness Week, is really to promote awareness, respect, and harmony among students and among the greater community. The United Islam Awareness Week is extra special because we have not just one university that's partaking in it. This project is a collection of a number of different universities, not just as Simon Fraser University, but also University of Saskatchewan, University of Regina. So it's really cool that our speaker that's joining us today, he flew in yesterday, but tomorrow first thing in the morning he's flying over to another city, and another speaker from a different city is going to be flying into Vancouver, and that's going to be taking place from throughout Tuesday to Friday to bring you a common theme and a common message. So that's something that's really quite unique. And this year's theme, everyone, is to be God-gifted, right? Is our moral and our conscious reality gifted by God? Is Islam a gift? Can Islam, its message, its teachings, truly impact our lives? Right? Is everything you've heard on the news or seen about Islam true? So throughout the week, we really invite you to contemplate, to explore with us, and to join us as we challenge preconceptions about Islam. And for this, we were joined by prominent Muslim speakers from across Northern America and internationally. We've been, we'll be having a number of beautiful and engaging conversations with them throughout the week, and evening lectures as we answer some of the most asked questions about Islam. So welcome to our first lecture titled Beyond the Bemused. Is it possible to overcome the pain, the suffering of our current reality? Can we empower our perspectives with the gifts of clarity, peace, and conviction? Fahad Tasleem, I'm privileged to invite him to the podium here today, is a founder of DC Seminary, an institute focused on spiritually empowering working professionals, graduates, and college students. He also serves as the head of U.S. outreach for UIAW, which is the Islamic Education and Research Academy. His diverse study and research interests include Quranic studies, da'wah, which is propagating the religion of Islam, Islamic and comparative theory, behavioral economics, economic history, and a whole plethora of various different degrees there. He studied Arabic at Georgetown University and is currently studying in the graduate program in the Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas. Is that still accurate? Oh, mashallah, tabarakallah. At Austin with a focus on Islamic theology. It's truly my privilege and my honor to welcome Sheikh Fahad Tasleem from Houston, Texas for tonight's keynote lectures. Thank you.
How's everyone doing this evening? Good. All right, let me start off as we traditionally do in the Islamic framework, and that is with a certain type of prayer, and that is we start off in the name of God. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulil Kareem. In the name of God, the Beneficent and Merciful, all praise and blessings are due to his, the last and final messenger, Muhammad. Now, the topic that I was given, it was called Beyond Bemused. It has a little bit to do with what you typically, or what philosophically might be called the problem of evil. But I wanted to start off with a recent video that I saw. Did you guys watch TED Talks at all? You're in a university setting, right? So there was a TED Talk that was done by Dr. Suzanne Barakat. Anyone familiar with who this is? You are, right? Some of the Muslims might be. So she was the sister of the 3 people that were murdered in North Carolina. It was on a college campus back in 2015. Now, her TED Talk, I'm going to kind of tell you what she said, but I wanted to kind of narrate to you in her own words, because I don't really think I could just tell you what she said and do it justice. And I'm not going to go through the entire TED Talk, but just some of the items that she mentioned. But I do encourage you to check it out. It is something that's very profound and very thought-provoking. So let me go ahead and start off with her talk about the incident, how it happened, the people that were involved. So just some background information. Her brother was named Dia, and his wife was Yusuf, and her sister is Razan. All right? These were the 3 people that were brutally murdered in their apartment. So let me just kind of narrate what she says. Like I said, I'm not going to be basically narrating everything, but I'd like you to really focus on kind of, if you can hear from the words themselves, the pain that she's expressing, right? Because we are talking about suffering and why God would let that happen. So she starts off and she says, it's December 27, 2014. The morning of my brother's wedding day. He asked me to come over and comb his hair in preparation for his wedding photo shoot. A 23-year-old, 6'3" basketball, particularly Steph Curry fanatic. I want you to picture this as you're listening to this. An American kid in dental school ready to take on the world. When Dia and Yusuf had their first dance, she's talking about the wedding, I see the love in his eyes. Her reciprocated joy and my emotions begin to overwhelm me. Now this is his sister here. I moved to the back of the hall and burst into tears. Now I want you to think about this for a second. Your sibling, like that one that you grew up with, he's coming of age and he's getting married. So at the wedding, she goes to the corner and she's sobbing, right? This is her little brother that grew up in front of her. And she says that, and as the second song finishes playing, he beelines towards me, buries me into his arms, and rocks me back and forth. Even in that moment, when everything was so distracting, he was attuned to me. He cups my face and says, Suzanne, I am who I am because of you. Thank you for everything. I love you. She says that about a month later, I'm back home in North Carolina. So she lives in California. She says, I'm back home in North Carolina for a short visit. And on the last evening, I run upstairs to Dia's room, eager to find out how he's feeling being a newly married man. With a boyish smile, he says, I'm so happy. I love her. She is an amazing girl. And she is. At just 21, she recently has been accepted to join Dia at the UNC Dental School. She shared his love for basketball, and at her urging, not his urging, at her urging, they started their honeymoon off attending their favorite team of the NBA, the LA Lakers. I'll never forget that moment sitting there with him as she's in his room. How free he was with his happiness. My little brother, a basketball-obsessed kid, had become and transformed into an accomplished young man. He was at the top of his dental school class, and alongside Yusuf and Razan was involved in local and international community service projects dedicated to helping the homeless and refugees, including a dental relief trip they were planning for Syrian refugees in Turkey. Razan, now this is his wife's sister, at just 19, used her creativity as an architectural engineer to serve those around her, making care packages for the local homeless, among other projects. That's who they were. Standing there that night, I take a deep breath and look at Dia and tell him, I have never been more proud of you than I am at this moment. He pulls me into his tall frame, hugs me goodnight, and I leave the next morning without waking him to go back to San Francisco. That is the last time I will ever hug him. 10 days later, I'm on call at San Francisco General Hospital when I receive a barrage of vague text messages expressing condolences. Confused, I call my father, who calmly intones, there's been a shooting in Dia's neighborhood in Chapel Hill. It's on lockdown, and that's all we know. So I hang up and I quickly Google shooting in Chapel Hill. One hit comes up, quote, 3 people were shot in the back of the head, confirmed dead on the scene. Something in me just knows. I fling out of my chair and faint onto the gritty hospital floor, wailing. I take the first red eye out of San Francisco, numb and disoriented. I walk into my childhood home and faint into my parents' arms, sobbing. I then run up to Dia's room, as I did so many times before, just looking for him, only to find a void that will never be filled. Investigation and autopsy reports eventually reveal the sequence of events. Dia had just gotten off the bus from class. Razan was visiting for dinner, already at home with Yusur. As they began to eat, they heard a knock at the door. When Dia opened it, their neighbor proceeded to fire multiple shots at him. According to 911 calls, the girls were heard screaming. The man turned towards the kitchen and fired a single shot into Yusur's hip, immobilizing her. He then approached her from behind, pressed the barrel of his gun against her head, and with a single bullet, lacerated her midbrain. The man then towards the kitchen, and then he then approached her from behind. He then turned towards Razan, who was screaming for her life, and execution style, with a single bullet to the back of the head, killed her. On his way out, he shot Dia one last time, a bullet in the mouth, for a total of 8 bullets, 2 lodged in the head, 2 in his chest, and the rest in his extremities. Dia, Yusur, and Razan were executed in a place that was meant to be safe, their home. For months, this man had been harassing them, knocking on their door, brandishing his gun on a couple of occasions. His Facebook was cluttered with anti-religion posts. Yusur felt particularly threatened by him. As she was moving in, he told Yusur and her mom that he didn't like the way they looked. In response, Yusur's mom told her to be kind to her neighbor, and that as he got to know them, he'd see them for who they were. The man who murdered my brother turned himself into the police shortly after the murder, saying he had killed 3 kids, execution style, over a parking dispute. The police issued a premature public statement that morning, echoing his claims about without bothering to question it or further investigate. It turns out, and he had mentioned that this was over a parking dispute. So it turns out that there was no parking dispute. There was no argument, no violation, but the damage was already done. In a 24-hour media cycle, the words parking dispute had already become the go-to soundbite. I sit on my brother's bed, remember his words, the words he gave me so freely, with so much love. I am who I am because of you. That's what it takes for me to climb through my crippling grief and speak out. I cannot let my family's deaths be diminished to a segment that is barely discussed on local news. They were murdered by their neighbor because of their faith, because of a piece of cloth they chose to don on their heads, because they were visibly Muslim. Some of the rage I felt at the time was that if roles were reversed and an Arab, Muslim, or Muslim-appearing person had killed 3 white American college students, execution style, in their home, what would we have called it? A terrorist attack. When white men commit acts of violence in the US, they're lone wolves, mentally ill, driven by a parking dispute. I know that I have to give my family voice, and I do the only thing I know. I send a Facebook message to everyone I know in the media. A couple of hours later, in the midst of a chaotic house overflowing with friends and family, our neighbor Neil comes over, sits down next to my parents, and asks, "What can I do?" Neil had over 2 decades of experience in journalism. And he says, I ask him what he thinks we should do. Given the bombardment of local media interview requests, he offers to set up a press conference at a local community center. Just tell me when, and I'll have all the news channels present. I delivered the press statement while still wearing scrubs from the previous night. And in under 24 hours from the murders, I'm on CNN being interviewed by Anderson Cooper. The following day, major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and so on, published stories about Dia, Yusur, and Razan, allowing us to reclaim the narrative and call attention to the mainstreaming of anti-Muslim hatred. Now, I'm mentioning this because I'd like you to take a moment and picture yourself in her shoes, in Suzanne Barakat's shoes. Like you have just lost, think about the closest person to you in your life, whether it's your mom, whether it's your father, your brother, your sister, your best friend, whoever it is. Imagine that they had just been killed like her brother, his wife, and her sister were killed. What would be your state? Would you be able to pick yourself up and go in front of national news outlets and basically be able to defend what the truth of the entire scenario was. Perhaps. With these TED Talks, I got a chance to kind of scroll down to some of the comments. And some of the terms that you see in the comments related to Dr. Suzanne Barakat's story, as she was telling this on this TED Talk, you find some very key adjectives. Courageous, strong, powerful, and being able to basically weather the storm. In fact, one comment said, had this happened to my own family, I would not have been able to hold it together with the strength and clarity that Suzanne demonstrates. So now, on one hand, you find that you have this person that throughout all of her grief, and as she's telling this, by the way, I really don't think I've done justice to it. And I really encourage you to watch the TED Talk yourself, because you can hear the shaking in her voice. Even a year later, or a few years later that she's giving this presentation, she's still shaking. Her voice is still shaking. Yet through all that grief, she was still able to stand strong. Now, the question that I wanted to present tonight is, what gives her that strength? Or what gave her that strength? What allowed her to go beyond just the grief, to completely capitulate to it and just break down, and to be able to go beyond that? Because someone else in those shoes might have had a different way of thinking. They may have said something like, you know what? Why would God let this happen to my sister, my brother, my mom, my colleague? Because if God is really all loving, unconditionally loving, and that he has the capability to do what he pleases, to do what he wants, why would he let that happen to these three people? Why would he take them away from me? I mean, again, the description, who was Dia, who was Yusra? I mean, these people, they were almost like living for the sake of other people, in the terms of their charity, in the terms of how they were helping people. And almost you can sense a certain type of purity in who they were. So one type of thinking might be, well, why would God want? Why would he do that? Is he not loving, unconditionally loving? And is he not the one that's capable of doing whatever he chooses? So why would he let such an evil thing happen? So I'm going to propose to you tonight that the strength that Dr. Suzanne Barakat showed had to do with something very deep and internal. And it had to do with what we could call existential realities. And what I mean by existential realities is the reality of a person's existence, your existence. Because every human being, when it comes down to it, at a certain point in their life, they're going to ask a certain question or certain questions about their own existence. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. Maybe when you get older, maybe when you get younger. But those questions are going to come up. Why am I here? How did I get here? And then where am I going? I want you to picture something. That as we're sitting here, you're listening to me talk, you just black out all of a sudden. All right, you guys with me in this thought experiment here? Yeah? All right. You black out. So you're listening to me talk, you black out. And as you wake up, you're on a plane. And this plane, it is remarkably comfortable. You're in first class. Really nice seats. You look out the window, and there's a beautiful scenery. You know when you see that, like that orange hue that's in the sky, and it's almost soothing to the eyes. And the temperature is just right. As human beings, we always have a problem with temperature, right? Sometimes it's too cold or too hot, or it's never just right? And if you have kids, you know this all the time, right? They're always like messing with the thermostat. But anyhow, so the temperature on this plane is just right. The seats are comfortable. The scenery is gorgeous. And then, so I think biryani was mentioned earlier, right? You guys like biryani? How many of you like biryani? I mean, I know you've tried it. Okay, you got some people. All right. So what's your favorite food, if you don't mind me asking?
Peppermint ice cream.
Peppermint ice cream. Okay. It's a little different than biryani, but okay, we'll go with it. So you're on this plane, and the host comes, and you see the cart, and on this cart is peppermint ice cream. Or fill in the blank with whatever your favorite food is, right? And for those of you who are thinking about biryani, you can smell it from a mile away, okay? So the cart is being pushed, and you get the food. It's presented to you, and you taste it, and it is the best peppermint ice cream you have ever had. And you're like, wow, this is amazing. So the question is, would you be happy? What do you think? Would you be happy? You'd be happy. Okay. Would you have meaningful happiness? You were sitting in a classroom, you black out, and the next thing you know, you're on this plane. Now, you could have all the food, all the delights you want. Would you be truly content and would you have meaningful happiness? Or would you have certain questions that would be gnawing at you? I think most of us would have certain questions, right? What would be some of the questions? What do you guys think? Where's the plane going, right? Like you were sitting in a classroom, and all of a sudden you're in a plane. Where's it taking me, right? What else? How did I get here, right? And what am I doing here, right? So how did I get here? Where's the plane going? And if you think about life in relation to this concept of like existential questions, you're on this metaphoric plane. You came into a state of consciousness at a certain point. You're going in a certain direction, which is death. And so those same questions that you have on that plane that was in this thought experiment, the human being must have these questions as they're going through life. How did I get here? What am I doing here? And where am I going, man? Where is this life taking me? So in relation to those existential questions, I wanted to kind of go through some of those questions from the Islamic perspective. What is from the Islamic framework, from the Islamic tradition, what are some of the answers to some of those questions? But the first question I want to start with, before we even get to the existential questions that I mentioned, which is related to a question about your existence, is about who you are. Like if I asked you, who are you? What would you reply? Like the gentleman right here in the glasses. Who are you, man? Phil, right? Okay, so this is Phil. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Phil. All right? Okay. And what's your name? Dean. Din. So Phil and Din. All right. Dayton. All right. My bad, man. We come from Texas, so if I have a little issue with my accent, All right. So Phil and Dayton, right? All right. So I want you guys to imagine something. All right. I want you guys to imagine that tomorrow you wake up, you're not Phil, you're not Dayton, but you're Dayton and you're Phil. Does that change who you are? Like, are you defined by only your name? Or is there a deeper reality to who you are, your being, in other words? I think most people would answer, just a change of names doesn't change who you are, like your own personality. So there's a verse in the Quran, and for those of you who don't know, the Quran is the book that Muslims hold to be the literal word of God. And it was revealed in Arabic to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I'm going to be quoting some of them, but just to give you some, a little bit of information, that's what we believe about the Quran. Now, in the Quran, there's a verse, and I'll say the Arabic first for the benefit of the Muslims here, where God or Allah says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ نَسْوَوا اللَّهَ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ أَنفُسَهُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْفَاسِقُونَ. So do not be like those who forgot God. So God then caused them to forget themselves. So I want you to think about this for a second. Is this referring to people that don't believe in God? Like, let's say that the quintessential person who has, in a sense, forgotten about God would be someone that doesn't believe in God. Someone that, let's say, holds a position of being an atheist. But has that person forgotten themselves? Does he or she forget to eat or, drink or, try to get a job or go to school? Have they forgotten themselves? And in essence, you'd have to say, no, they haven't. So what is this referring to? Well, when you look at some of the commentary on this verse, it's actually referring to something much deeper than that. In the sense that when you think of who you are, you're not just a material being. In fact, you're something much deeper than that. Because like we said, if we just switched your names, well, you're still you. And if you take that analogy a little further, if you took like a body part, let's say your arm was cut off, do you stop being you? And may God protect us from that. But if your arm's cut off, do you stop being you? What do you think? I don't think so, right? What if your second arm's cut off? Do you stop being you? Let's say your legs are gone. No. So what really makes you you? Is it really just the neurological workings of brain matter that are residing in the skull and that are charging, that make you you? Or is there something that's deeper that makes you who you are? Because the reality is, your conscious state, you can't define it by simply looking at brain matter. Because there's a material brain matter, and there's a conscious state that you have. Something that defines who you are. Like you have a certain inner subjective experience, for instance. When we were talking about biryani, right? You taste biryani, but your inner subjective experience is limited to you. You could describe what you want in terms of biryani. Like it tastes, it's spicy, it's a little salty, it's got a little kick, and this and that. But to truly experience what biryani is as you, I could never do that. Because you have a certain conscious state that transcends your material body. And from the Islamic perspective, we say that that state or that conscious state of yours, that isn't your material body, that defines who in fact you really are, that gives you your personality, your consciousness, actually comes from God. And it comes from the fact that He's given you a spiritual reality, which we call the ruh, the spirit, the soul. And so, from that perspective, when we ask the question, who are you? You're not just limited to this material body. There's something else that makes you who you are. From the Islamic perspective, like I mentioned, it's your spirituality, it's your reality, it's your soul that actually makes you you. Now, there's an interesting, and by the way, this is not necessarily limited to the Islamic framework, because you find traditions in the past that have kind of mentioned the same sort of idea. So, for those of you who know about like Hinduism, for instance, there's an interesting statement in the Upanishads where it says, man in his ignorance identifies himself with the material sheets that encompass his real self. These material sheets are just material. They'll fade away. And they don't really explain true consciousness. In fact, even when you go through certain areas of neuroscience, they have something known as the hard problem of consciousness. In other words, the question arises, how is it that you have this material brain matter and you're able to get consciousness? Where does consciousness actually lie? Is it, if you break down the brain material into the cells, is it the single cells where you have consciousness? Or where is your consciousness? So the reality is there's a certain jump, a certain gap that a material or a materialistic worldview wouldn't be able to solve. And that is something that each and every single human being experiences, your conscious state. So from the Islamic framework, we said that that is something that is part and parcel of you, and it's known as your soul, or the ruh. Now, I mentioned the Quran a few minutes ago, and there is something really interesting about the Quran, or certain ayat of the Quran, certain verses of the Quran, that I wanted to go through. And there's a phenomenon in the Quran from a linguistics point of view. I know I'm taking a big jump here. This guy's going all over the place, from neuroscience to consciousness to, just hang on. You'll kind of get where I'm going, inshallah, right? God willing. So there's a group of verses, and this group of verses, it basically, what a person can observe when going through this group of verses is something that's known in the Arabic language as iltifat, which is grammatical shifts. Right? So, to give you an example of a grammatical shift, if someone is speaking, let's say, in the third person, and then they shift to the second person. So, quick English lesson here, I guess. What's the first person? Actually, I shouldn't teach you guys this. You guys are in college. What do we mean by first person? Help me out here. I, right? I, we. All right, what's second person? You. And the third person? He, she, right? He, she, it, whatever it might be. Okay, fourth person? No, I'm just messing with you. I was like, what? What do you mean? All right. So in this group of verses, there's a grammatical shift that happens that's related to this idea of the conscious being and the soul. And I want you to just listen to them for a second. I'll recite them first in the Arabic, and then we'll go through them, and I'll kind of point out the grammatical shift to kind of highlight where I'm going with this. So I'll start off, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذي أحسن كل شيء خلقه وبدأ خلق الإنسان من طين ثم جعل نسله من سلالة من ماء مهين ثم سواه ونفخ فيه من روحه وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. So the first verse, it starts off and it says, الذي أحسن كل شيء خلقه. That it's speaking about God, and that God is the one who perfected everything which He created. And He began the creation. وَبَدَأَ خَلْقَ الْإِنسَانِ مِنْ طِينٍ. He began the creation of the human being from teen, from this clay-like substance. In other words, it's a material substance that you find in the earth, for instance. Those elements, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the carbon, whatever it is, earthly elements, material elements. But notice that the speech, as it's being related, it's being narrated in the third person. He created it. This shell, this sheet, this compartment, you can say, in the third person. Right? Am I right on that, or is that incorrect?
Yes.
Right, okay. And then it says, ثُمَّ جَعَلَ نَسْلَهُ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِّن مَّاءٍ مَّهِينٍ. And then He made His posterity out of an extract of a liquid disdain. In other words, He causes generations to move forward by intercourse. Right? Here there's talk about a liquid disdain, speaking about sperm. Right? And yet it's still in the third person. So he's talking about the creation of the human being, that it has earthly elements, and that generations move forward by a process that we all know about, the sexual process. And it's still speaking in the third person. Then it says, ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِهِ. And then He proportioned it, or him. Then He proportioned him. He made it, gave it form, gave it shape, and blew into it the ruah, the spirit. Now, we're still at third person here. So you start off by creating it, creates it out of clay, and then it goes on, it moves it generations, this shell, this thing that's being created, and then He blows into it the ruah, blows into it the soul, its soul. But here's where the shift happens. Ready? Then He says, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ. And then He made for you. Now we went from third person to second person. He made for you. وَجَعَلَ لَكُمْ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبَصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ. And then He made for you hearing, seeing, and the ability to think. But little are you grateful. Now the question is, why was there a shift from third person to second person? Because you see, once the ruh is in the human being, now we can actually address it. Do you see how that changes the verse itself? In other words, because now they have a spiritual reality, a conscious reality, now it can be addressed. You can be addressed. And so you're being addressed in the sense that He made for you the ability to hear. But the ability to hear is not just limited to the fact that you have an ear and a tube and all the functionality, the material functionality that goes with hearing. It goes with something much deeper than that. Because when you hear something, there's a certain process that you consciously understand. Similarly, when you see something, these are not just random neurons that are going off in the brain, but rather there's something that you're censoring via your visual perception that you can only know if you're a conscious being. And finally, the ability to think, to have reason. Again, this goes back to being conscious. And then the verse ends off by saying few people are actually grateful related to that. So, when it comes to who you are, the Islamic answer is very straightforward. That you are indeed a creation of God. And that your true state is one of a spiritual nature. The material body has its significance and so on and so forth. But really who you are has to do with something much more deeper than that. Something that you experience on a daily basis that perhaps you never thought twice about. Your conscious reality. But then there's another question that's related to that. Bismillah. And that is, if we say that we understand who we are, and we see that it has a connection with God, who is God? So, remember I had mentioned the question of, having a person that would say, why would God do this to me? Right? I said, there was this courage that Suzanne Barakat had, and that a lot of people may not have it. They may have other questions like, why would God allow this suffering? Why would He let them suffer? And why am I going through this suffering? And I think a lot of times what happens is that who God is sometimes simplified. And sometimes it has a certain bias in defining who God is, right? I think that bias a lot of times comes from a Christian worldview or a Christian view of who God is. Because notice when I said, why would a God who is all love, all loving, unconditionally loving, do such a thing if he has the ability to stop it? But you see, what we're talking about here is that we're taking two of the names or attributes of God, extrapolating them, and basically saying that here are the two things that God is, and that's it. From the Islamic framework, in fact, God has many names and attributes. He's not just all loving or all, the all capable, but he's also the all wise. He's al-Hakim. He's the all knowing, al-Alim. He is al-Adl, the one that's just, the one that is maximally perfectly just, and so on and so forth. And the reality is when someone says unconditionally loving, this is from a Christian worldview. It's not part of the Islamic worldview. Because for us, we say that the names and attributes of God are maximally perfect. And therefore, not only is he loving, but he's also just. And he's wise. And therefore, if he's wise and he's all-knowing, then there are certain things that are related to his wisdom that he may put a person through some sort of calamity or some sort of suffering that is in the realm of his wisdom. And so when we ask the question, who is God? Sometimes we're a bit mistaken when we start to now blame God. Because we've, in a sense, forgotten that, or maybe not forgotten, but we're not quite aware of who God really is. That his names and attributes are those of maximal perfection. When it comes to this idea of trust, for instance, a lot of times what happens is someone, you'll tell them that, look, all of these things that happen, the suffering that a person goes through, it's because of a certain wise purpose. And the person would say, "Is really that's what you're going to do? You're going to pull out the wisdom card?" Someone that's actually gone through suffering, someone that's really going through pain, may not really appreciate that. But the reality is, as human beings, we do this, we have this phenomena in our own lives. When you go to the doctor, let's say, God forbid, he says, you know what, we're going to have to amputate your leg, because if you don't, you will die. Now, you don't say, look, before you amputate my leg, I need to know exactly why, what is the system, how exactly this is going to work, and in fact, I need to go to medical school, do an internship in neurosurgery or surgery or whatever it might be, get all the qualifications, and then I will trust you. And then the doctor says, look, bro, by then you're going to be dead, right? It's going to be game over for you. You don't. You put that trust because you understand that doctor knows a lot more than you do. And you let him perhaps take off your leg. And what do you do at the end? Thank you so much, doctor. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everything that you've done. He just cut off your leg, man. Right? And yet you're appreciative of it. I mean, and think about it. Like when you board a plane, the pilot, he says, ladies and gentlemen, we are embarking on flight so-and-so, and please have a seat and please fasten your seatbelts. I mean, you don't get up and become some obstinate punk and start like breakdancing in the aisle saying, what does he know? Let's do this, people. No. You trust the pilot. This man has had experience in flight and so on and so forth. So you buckle your seatbelt. And so if that is true when it comes to the other human beings, how much more so is it than one that transcends the human being? Right? That human limitation of knowledge, the one that transcends that human limitation of knowledge, how much more so is it for the one that is Al-Hakim, Al-Alim, the one that is wise, the one that knows everything, knows all of the variables when it comes to morality, physicality, or whatever it might be. All of those variables. Because at the end, when the human being makes this pronouncement, they're making a judgment without all the facts. You don't know, man. You prejudge. In fact, the term prejudice comes from there, right? What, like prejudice occurs when? When you prejudge something. You assume something, and you've come into the state of prejudice. But you don't have all the facts, man. And so we're already prejudging a statement where, it's like, tomorrow you're going to be visited by a speaker. His name is Hamza Zortis. He says, God has the picture, and we only have the pixels. That's the reality of it, right? God can see the pictures. You can only see the pixels. You're limited. There's a verse in the Quran which kind of highlights that. And it says, وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. For it might be that you hate a thing, but there's a lot of good in it. وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ. And it may be that you love something, but it is extremely evil for you. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And God knows, and you don't. So it's kind of, when we come back to this idea, it's that there are certain wisdoms, there's a certain wisdom in why God would put a human being through suffering. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention here real quick is that when you look at the Islamic tradition, and I encourage you to do this study on your own if you get the chance, and you compare it to other traditions that try to expound upon what could be the possible wisdom behind suffering, or wisdoms behind suffering, you find that the Islamic tradition is replete with information as to what are some of those wisdoms. Not all of them, because if you know it all, you're at the same status as the one that knows it all, right? God. But the fact that you have so much in the Islamic tradition outlining what are some of those wisdoms, which I'll cover some of them, but you'll be very surprised to find what some of those wisdoms are that we know through our tradition. And like I said, we'll get to some of them at the end once we finish this section on those existential concerns or existential questions, right? Because then they'll make a little more sense. So we understood who we are. We understand who God is. So why are we here? What's the purpose? What are we doing here? Why do we exist? And very simply put, it's the reason why we exist, the reason why God created the human being, is for none other than to worship Him, to worship God. Now, when I say worship, I don't mean just physical acts of worship, like prayer and all. But what I'm talking about is going back to your true reality, that spiritual state that you have. Because this worship that we're talking about is not merely an act of the limbs, of the body, but it's an act of the heart, of the soul, of your consciousness, of your reality, in fact. And so when we say that God created us to worship Him, worship has a few things that are a part of it. Number one, it has to do with love of God. Like, if we understand who God is, that God is the one that if it wasn't for God, from the Islamic perspective, that all of the bodily functions that you enjoy every single day, you wouldn't have them. And why do you actually even deserve them? Like, you have a heart, a brain, eyes. What did you do to deserve the functioning body that you have? And if you think about it, just one thing that could go wrong, and that would completely destroy your physical reality. And yet it doesn't. And all of those things, what makes you so special that you deserve those things, right? In fact, the one that placed them in you is the one that deserves that praise and that love. So that natural inclination to love the one that bestowed favors, right? Starting from physical favors, but also just other things that you're blessed with, right? And they always say, like, you don't realize what you're blessed with until it's taken away, right? You don't realize the blessing of your molar teeth until you have a toothache and you're ending up in the doctor's chair who's drilling away, right? So that first component of worship, our purpose, is that love of God. But the second component is submission unto God. Because if it's true that God knows everything, then it only makes sense that if He were to command you to do something, to urge you to stay away from something, that He knows and your knowledge is limited. Just like that doctor, you're going to say, all right, well, if that's the advice you give, then I should take it. How much more so when it comes to the one that knows it all? So there's two components, love and submission. And what we find when it comes to love and this idea of connecting with your reality or your spiritual reality or conscious reality is that a lot of times it's not only because He has blessed you with certain things, but it's because of who God is Himself. Like, how many people, have you guys been to Niagara Falls? Yeah? Canadian side or American side? I'm sorry, man. The American side isn't all that great. I have to admit that. You know, coming from Texas, it's not really that great. When you saw the Niagara, so who said they went to the Niagara Falls? All right, so right there, when you saw it, how did you feel?
Sorry.
Either one, that's fine. I mean, go ahead, the guy in the black jacket.
I mean, it's very beautiful.
Very beautiful.
Yeah.
All right.
Lots of water.
Lots of water. Okay, yeah, that's. So, I'll tell you how I felt. Right, I was in this state of awe. Right, have you guys experienced awe before? How do you explain awe? Like, how do you rationally explain it? The reality is, when you see something that's greater than yourself, you are in a state of awe. Right. In fact, there was an article in Psychology Today recently, and it mentions that they did some studies, and it said that the people that experience awe more often are in fact happier. Right? But that awe, it's pointing to something else. Right? That waterfall is there because of the one that placed it there. And that awe is, they say awe-inspiring. So you can see a piece of art, and you say, wow, that's awe-inspiring. But what about the one that put that art together? The capability that person has. Or let me give you a different example, because art might be it's like art, man. Who cares about that? Some people might say that, right? Steph Curry. You guys like basketball?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah. There we go. Steph Curry makes a jump shot, and it's all rim, or it's all, not all rim, sorry. It's all net, right? All rim would be really bad. But anyways, it's all net. And, you see him, and it's beautiful, right? I mean, you see his shot, the way he jumps, and you hear the whoosh, and you're just awestruck, right? But you're awestruck because of the capability of the player. Like, this guy is just amazing. And you end up praising the player, right? Like, this guy is remarkable, man. The way he hits those jump shots, it's incredible. And yet, when you're awestruck when it comes to the created world around you, should not there then be praise for the abilities and the capabilities and who God is at the end of the day, right? So that concept of love coming to that connection of awe of who God is, and then the blessing that God has bestowed upon the person. So when we say that our purpose in life is worship, what we mean by worship is a love of God coupled with a submission to God's will. And that's why we were created. The Quran tells us, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, that I did not create the human being and the jinn and the spirits except for my worship. So, why are we here? To worship God, to submit to God, to praise God, to be grateful, right? And I always find it interesting when you find, when you're working in like the area of like entrepreneurship and you're trying to organize your day and things like that. Like I just ordered this journal. It's supposed to be like a really, really good journal in terms of organizing your day and all that. And I noticed that, it gives you time slots. It gives you kind of, what you have to do, when you have to do it, how to organize. It's a really good journal. And at the end it says, at the end of the day, I am grateful for, and it gives you 4 places to write down what you're grateful for. Right? So it's not just something I think that's limited to just Muslims. I think all of us, when someone opens a door and you walk through, you always say thank you. It's kind of like a natural base state. The human being is one that is grateful. I mean, unless they're just really mean, right? You'll find that a lot in Texas, not so much here in Canada, though. But the customs, I was able to, or not the immigration, when I got to the airport, they really liked me a lot here. And so I was there for a good 2 hours. And 2 hours, okay, fine, they're questioning me and everything. But one thing I did notice is that they're very courteous, right? They were not mean in any way whatsoever. Like, so I can't even be mad at them, right? Like in the States, you can be mad at the guy, like, so where were you and what did you do? But here it's like, oh, no problem, sir, I hope you understand. This is just a question. I'm like, wow, I mean, yeah, I might miss my flight, but, I'm not mad. It's strange, right? Anyhow, so our purpose, when it comes down to it, from the Islamic viewpoint, from the Islamic framework, is that we were created to worship God, to recognize God, to know God, and to submit ourselves to God. Now, one other area, let me just take that back. Yeah. One other area when it comes to the existential questions or existential realities from the Islamic framework, Bismillah, is the nature of the world that we live in. This world that we're in, that we find ourselves in, that metaphoric plane, for lack of a better analogy at this point. Like, what is the nature of this world? A lot of times, our worldview might be one that the only thing that counts is our existence in this life. And the reality is that when you think about this world, and again, from a Christian worldview, this world is actually good. Right? So, for God so loved the world, He sent His only begotten Son, right? So, etc. But from an Islamic point of view, you find that this temporary life that we have, and I stress temporary, is not something that's necessarily good per se. Right? In Arabic it's called hayat ad-dunya, the life of this world. And the term dunya comes with something that's lowly, adna, low. Right? So it's not something that's necessarily praiseworthy. And if there is something like dunya, something lowly, then there has to be hayatul ulya. There has to be something that's higher than that, better than that. So right off the bat, from the word that's used to describe this temporary life, we see that it's juxtaposing two realities. One of this temporary world and one of an afterlife. That in fact is of a higher status in the eyes of God. And so this world, what we find is that it has elements of pleasure and it has elements of pain. Because when you think of like pure bliss, from the Islamic point of view, pure bliss is only in paradise. That's where you get pure bliss. And pure suffering is in the hellfire. There's a famous scholar by the name of Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. And he tries to give kind of an idea of bliss in this life and how to compare it to paradise. He says, when you think about like sexual climax, right? That moment, because that moment may be something like what paradise might be like. Maybe. Just maybe, right? But this just for that moment. But yet paradise is pure bliss. It's that and then some, right? That you can't even fathom. And in fact, one of the realities, when you look at the Quran, it gives a description of paradise, or the people who go into paradise. And it says, for instance, مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا. They will be in paradise, meaning the people that believe and worship God and so on and so forth. They will be in paradise, makith. Now this term makith is very interesting. Because typically, when you think about a pleasure in this temporary life of ours, like you enjoy it like the first time. And then let's say you get it for the second time, the third time. But the thing is, there's this diminishing returns on your state of enjoyment. Like if you buy a new car, or a new house, let's say. You buy a new house, what happens on the first day? You love it, right? And you want to show it off. So you invite your friends over, like, hey man, check out my house. And like, yeah, it's great, man. You might even take them to the bathroom, man. They'll even check out the toilets. Great, right? I mean, you're so excited about it. What happens a year later? Someone comes over. Hey, man, I see you got a new house. You're like, yeah, thinking about moving to Houston is better, right? I want a new house. The term makith is the exact opposite. Meaning that pleasure that you have, it doesn't decrease, but it increases abadan, forever. So that pleasure that you taste in paradise is something it's not diminishing, it's increasing. And so that's what we say when we talk about paradise being pure bliss. But this world isn't a state of pure bliss, nor is it a state of pure suffering. But that's reserved for the next life. And so, it's interesting that that there's a very famous tradition, a narration of the Prophet Muhammad, speaking about this temporary life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, God's peace and blessings be upon him, where he says that ad-dunya sijn al-mu'min wa jannatul kafir, that this world is a prison for the believer and a paradise for the unbeliever. It's an interesting way of looking at it, right? And most people that will look at it say, yeah, it's a prison for the believer because Islam is hard, right? I gotta pray, I gotta fast, I gotta go for a hajj, right? Gotta give zakat, and all these, the pillars of Islam is, submitting unto God is hard. So that's why it's a prison. But there's an interesting story from a scholar whose name is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. May God's peace be upon him. May God have mercy upon him. And one day he was riding on a horse. And he used to be a very famous judge in a certain city in the Muslim world. And so he was well known. And this Jewish man passes in front of his horse. And this Jewish man is very poor. His clothes are ripped. He's barely he's hungry. He doesn't have much money. And so he goes to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And he says to him, look man, I heard that your Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, God's peace be upon him, he said that this world is a prison for the believers and a paradise for the unbelievers. So he says, yeah, that's true. He says, so how do you explain our situation? You're a judge, you have all this money, and you're like, you're living it up. And here I am, my clothes are torn, I'm tattered and everything. How do you explain this? And you got to marvel at the perception and the kind of the intellectualism of the scholars of the past. He says, yeah, it's true, because when I look at my state compared to paradise, I'm in a prison. And when I look at your state compared to the hellfire, you're in paradise, man. Right? And the man was overtaken. He actually became Muslim, So what is the nature of this temporary world? It is that we're not here just to live it up and have fun, but there's a purpose. That purpose is to worship God. And in order to worship God, you need to have trials and tribulations. You need to have a moral choice. Because if everything was morally correct, then where's the choice and where is you submitting out of your own free will, your true spiritual reality, submitting out of your true free will to either doing something right or doing something wrong? So therefore, the nature of this world is one of that it's going to be tests. They say ad-dunya bala, right? That this world is tests and tribulations. But the reality is that it's temporary. The Prophet Muhammad, he mentions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka gharib or 'abir as-sabil." Be in this world as if you're a stranger or you're a traveler. Because the reality is, we're all going to die. It doesn't matter if you're Muslim or non-Muslim. You know that. I don't think anyone in here, if all of your mental faculties are working, that you would deny that this life will come to an end sooner or later. And so therefore, why are you putting so much stress on it in lieu of that which is supposed to be forever? Right? Like I've come here to Vancouver. Now, it would be very foolish of me to go and just say, you know what, Vancouver's nice, I'll just buy a house here.
Good luck.
Like, oh, good luck, right? That's true. I heard about your real estate prices, and that's why I live in Houston. Anyway. But it would be foolish, right? Like, bro, man, you're only here for like a day, like a couple more hours. Why would you buy a house to settle in? That makes no sense. And so the reality is that when we think about this temporary world, we almost like to just settle in it. Like, we're going to be here forever. We're going to live forever, man. It's like I remember they had an interview with the late Michael Jackson, right? And they said, well, they asked him, so what do you think about life? He says, I want to live forever. But even he didn't live forever, right? With all the money and the influence and everything that he had, this life comes to an end. This temporary life of tests and tribulations. So our question then comes, as I said, in terms of our existential questions. Why are we here? Who are we? Where are we going? I think we've kind of covered those more or less. Now, how are we doing on time? How are we doing? Any timekeepers here, or am I just... 7.6. 7.6 what? Minutes left?
No, 7 hours and 26 minutes.
Okay, 7 hours, 26 minutes before I leave for my flight. Okay, got it. All right. It's very precise, by the way. 7, all right. MashaAllah. All right. So let me try. If you remember, we started this discussion off with the shootings in North Carolina, right? And then what would happen if that was you? If someone that was truly close to you and you lost them, and that maybe you'd wonder, why would God do that? So after understanding kind of our existential reality from an Islamic worldview, I wanted to kind of mention some of the wisdoms. And I can't cover, 7 minutes now, it's probably going on to 6. I won't be able to cover all of them, and there's a lot. But I wanted to mention some of them. Some of those things that we say that God puts a person in a certain situation of suffering and pain for this reason, for this wisdom. So let me mention a few, and then I guess we'll end there with as many as I can cover. So one of those wisdoms that we know from the Islamic tradition, and I was kind of speaking about it earlier, is to remind the human being of the temporary nature of this life. Because the thing is, the word for human being in Arabic is insan, which comes from nasiya, which means to forget. As human beings, we get really busy. Things happen. We have work and school and exams and essays and all sorts of other things that are keeping us totally disconnected from our true selves and our connection with God. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, it's not about that. It's about the fact that you will find distance between yourself and God because of the vicissitudes of life, the busyness of life. So sometimes what happens is, in order for you to remember that this life is temporary, God will shake you to have you wake up and remind you that, hey man, you're only here for a very short time. And the thing is, one of the spiritual diseases that is spoken about in Islamic tradition is what's known as hubb dunya. It is a love for this world. Because you're assuming now that this world is all there is, and therefore you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, which is going to come to an end anyway. So in order for you to wake you up, sometimes God puts you through a certain tribulation. Sometimes Allah puts you through a certain situation or tribulation, some sort of situation, to have you wake up, to remind you. And in fact, one of the ayahs, one of the verses in the Quran, very powerful, it says that اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في أموال والأولاد. That know, it's in the command tense, فعل الأمر. It's in the command tense. So know that indeed, and the tense here is that the life of this world, and there's like, the life of this world is only la'ib, playing around. When you're a kid, what are you worried about? Oh, I took my toy, he did this, and then just playing around, right? Having a good time. Walahu. And it's like diversion, amusement, right? Wazina. It's an adornment. How many things of this life that you just love? How many things of this life you just love? You like ice cream, you like biryani, right? But it's an adornment, right? What does it signify for your true essence, your true spiritual essence? وَتَفَاخُرُ بَيْنَكُمْ. And it is a boasting between yourselves, right? Like you're saying, like you start having a job, you get a better job, your brother has this job, your friend has this, and so now you're like, guess what, man? I graduated from Simon Fraser University, and we rock, right? And what's the other one you guys are against? UBC, and y'all suck, right? You guys understand y'all, right? Right? It's boasting. Like I have this, and then I have this job, and I was hired by Google, man, or whatever it is, whatever there is. So it's mutual, it's competition, it's boasting, right? وَتَكَاثُرُ فِي أَمْوَالِ وَالْأَوْلَادِ. And it's collecting money and children. Like you're busy with collecting more and more and more money. When the reality is, what does money directly do with your spiritual reality, right? It has some significance. But what does it do when the fact that life is going to end? So number one of the reasons why God, one of the wisdoms behind Him putting you through some suffering is that it's to remind you of the temporary nature of this world, of this hayat ad-dunya. Another one is to remind you about who God is. Remember, we said that God has names and attributes. And sometimes what happens is we forget who exactly God is. Again, Muslim or non-Muslim. Because we have this quality of having this forgetfulness of who God is. So, for instance, the Quran says, in terms of people that are put through a certain situation, go through some sort of suffering, or lose someone, it says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ. And the people who, when a disaster strikes them, قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. They say, when the disaster strikes them, they say, indeed we belong to God, and indeed to Him we will return. It's a very famous story or narration that comes from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when one of the companions, one of the female companions, she had a child, and this child one night died, and the husband had gone away somewhere. And when the husband came home, and the child was sick for some time, so the husband came home, and he said, how is our son doing? Now he had died, and she had basically kind of left him in the room, covered him with a cloth, and he said that his state is better than it was before. He says, okay, and so then she makes dinner and all these things and whatever, they eat together, and she says, let me ask you a question. What do you think about a neighbor? And this neighbor that, they had let you borrow something, and when when the neighbor demands it back, the other neighbor gets upset. What do you think about someone like that? He says, well, that's terrible. It belongs to the neighbor, so why should you as a borrower be upset at that, right? It's their thing. قَالُوا إِنَّ لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّ إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Right? That surely we belong to God and to Him is the return. So she says, truly God had given us something that we were borrowing in a sense. And to God, God owns us. God is the one that gave it to us and He's taken it back. And it's very profound when you think about it, right? So the reality is sometimes something that Allah, that God will take away from you. And you notice this in Muslim circles, that when someone dies, Muslims say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Right? Surely to Allah we belong, and to Him is the return. Right? Because the reality is, as much as we like to think that we own ourselves, you don't. Right? In fact, there's all sort of, political ramifications of owning yourself. Right? That's where the libertarians get their driving force. But anyways, I don't want to go down that path right now. So sometimes just to remind you about who God is, let me just leave you with one more, and we'll conclude there because I think my time's almost up. Sometimes God will put a person in a certain situation to have them have compassion for other people. Like this term compassion, even in the English language, it comes from like the root of compassio. And passio, passion, comes from suffering, right? Like the passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ, right? So compassio is to be at one with someone's suffering. In fact, you see this in other languages too. So for those of you who speak Urdu, for instance, the word for compassion is hamdardi. Hamdardi. You have dard, which is pain, and you're at one with someone in their pain. So sometimes God will put you, Allah will put you in a certain situation because perhaps you didn't realize the situation that someone else was going through. You never walked in their shoes. Now I know all of us can say we know that suffering exists. But there's a big difference knowing something and experiencing something. It's a big difference, right? Like you know that, let's say someone tells you about chocolate. Yeah, you have information about chocolate. But eating chocolate is a very different phenomenon to experience it. In fact, there's a very interesting thought experiment that was done by a philosopher named Frank Jackson, 1982. It's called Mary's Room. Anyone heard about this? Very interesting. Basically, he does this thought experiment. He says, imagine that there's a woman named Mary, okay? And she is in a black and white room. And everything around her is black and white. She's a neuroscientist. So her screen is black and white. All of her books are black and white. And she's a neuroscientist, and she has specialized in color and color perception. And so she is an expert in color perception. And so she has understood everything related to the pathways, the neurological happenings, the brain lighting up in certain areas when certain color is experienced. And she is she is an expert in it. But she's in a black and white room. Black and white screen, black and white books, and that's all she's ever known. Now all of a sudden something goes wrong with her monitor and she sees color. She sees like a red apple. Is it different for her? Has she learned anything new? Like technically learned anything new? She hasn't, right? But she's experienced something. And so experiencing something is very different than just knowing about something. And sometimes God puts you in a certain situation so it'll invoke in you compassion. I just mentioned like a personal story. Many years ago, I was living in Virginia, and I remember I had my firstborn, and he was just an infant, and we were driving somewhere, and I realized that I've run out of gas. And by the way, this is before the days of cell phones, so now I'm like dating myself now. That's how old I am. But anyways, I didn't have a pager either. So I'm driving, and the gas runs out, and I'm like, or it doesn't run out, but it's going down, and I didn't realize it, and I'm like, oh man, I should probably get some gas, and the car stops, right? And I'm like, oh great, so I have this infant, and it's midwinter. This is Virginia, not Texas, right? So it's not like, oh, winter, great, right? Virginia, it was snowing, it was really bad. And so there I am, stuck on the side of the road, no gas, nothing, with an infant in the car. And I'm like, okay, so I guess I just have to bundle him up and walk to a gas station. And then I realized, I'm like, I forgot my wallet at home. Talk about, oh my God, what a terrible situation. So I'm like, so I guess I'll have to walk to the gas station, maybe try to find a payphone. How am I going to pay for the payphone, right? Maybe and in the midst of all that, somebody pulls over. He sees that I'm there, and he says, look, man, are you in trouble? I said, yeah, and I told him my whole situation. He said, just wait here. So he goes to the gas station, fills up like a gas container, comes up, fills my tank, and that was it. And so for me, it was like, wow, I mean, talk about someone that's just so benevolent. But the thing, what that experience did for me, there's a certain phenomenon that happens in Houston gas stations specifically. And what happens is, I don't know if it happens here, but in a gas station, a lot of times what happens is someone pulls over, and they come to you at the gas station and say, hey man, look, I need to get to so-and-so place, and I need $10 just for some gas. Could you please give me $10, or could you just fill my tank, or whatever it is? To this day, I just can't say no. I just can't. Right? And I think, and God knows best, but I think that if I didn't have that initial experience, maybe I'd be like, well, who knows? Maybe they didn't work hard enough. Right? Or whatever it is. You could have all sorts of excuses that come up in the mind, right? But the reality is like, okay, I had that experience. And so sometimes God would put you through a certain situation to invoke in you, to make arise within you the idea of being compassionate to your fellow human beings. Okay? So, with that said, I'm going to basically conclude here, and I'll leave you with one statement in conclusion, and then we can open up for some Q&A, I think, if there's some time. And that statement comes from a man by the name of Viktor Frankl, and he was a Holocaust survivor. I want you to just reflect upon what he said, and I'm going to leave you with this. He said, if you find meaning in your suffering, then your suffering is no longer suffering. So, with that, thank you very much. I wanted to thank the MSA for inviting me, and thank you for your patience.
Jazakallah khair, and thank you, Sheikh Fahad Tasleem, for that very enlightening lecture. I'm hoping that opened up some conversations that you might be thinking about, or some questions that may have come up. I'd invite you at this time, if you have written any questions down, you can just pass them to the wings of the aisles here, and we'll collect them. We'll get some of the question and answers going. And while we just collect those cue cards right there, I just want to give an announcement for the rest of the programs that are taking place throughout the week. So today we had the Beyond Bemused lecture that took place today. Tomorrow we'll be having Gifts of Life take place in the same hall tomorrow, and that will be given by Sheikh Hamza Sources. The day after tomorrow, January 24th, which is Thursday, we'll have drawing from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that will be taking place in the Blessing Hall, room 9660. So Blessing Hall, room 9660. And Friday, we're joined by Abdullah Al-Andalusi. He comes from the UK, and we'll be having the final lecture, Total Knockoff. So I invite all of you to continue to join us, and please spread the word for that. And we're just going to collect the questions here and get the Q&A panel going. Oh, yeah, someone in front. Yeah, you're welcome to go ahead.
Sure. I mean, is there any? I only got two, so are there any more?
Maybe start with that one, and then we can keep them going.
Okay. Do you want to? So, the questioner here is asking. Let's see. Okay, so the questioner here is asking, what is your or the Muslim state of mind on those who know, worship, and recognize God, yet do so with ill intent to others? Why does God do this? If they do not realize that what they do, I'm assuming, is hurts others, where do they go if they believe they are worthy of paradise, while other like-minded but kind individuals believe otherwise? Okay, so remember we had, and I think I understand the question, if I haven't, please forgive me for that, but remember we had spoken about the idea of having been given a free choice, right? And that too, specifically having given a free moral choice. So it seems like what the questioner is asking, that if they believe that what they're doing is good and yet it's not, well, remember we said that God is just. That's one of his names and attributes. And so whatever that judgment related to that person's knowledge, that'll be meted out to the person. So it's one thing knowingly doing something or knowingly harming someone is a different paradigm than someone that just doesn't know, right? You're not held accountable from an Islamic viewpoint of what you just don't know. So, and again, that goes back to his attribute of being al-adl, or being the just. Now the second part, if they do not realize what they do hurts others, where do they go if they believe they're worthy of paradise? So I think what the question is asking is that, let's say a person was born somewhere where his parents basically taught him everything but Islam, right? So what happens to these people? Well, a couple of things that we need to understand is that there's a narration from the Prophet Muhammad who mentions that on the Day of Judgment, there will be a few groups of people that will be brought forth. And amongst them, if my memory serves me correct, will be the people that couldn't hear, people that were deaf. And there were people that didn't have the mental facilities to be able to understand, right? So people that have not been given mental facilities in the world. There will be people that are between the prophets. And some of the scholars interpret that to mean people that never got the message of Islam. Meaning they never, no one kind of told them that, like, this is the correct path. And perhaps the fourth category, if I'm not mistaken, is children or something like that. I'm not 100% sure on the fourth category. But these people will be brought forth on the Day of Judgment. And unlike us, right, who have consciousness in this world and all of that, they get to see the Day of Judgment clear as day. Right? So all of the happenings on the Day of Judgment, they get to see it. And then God will basically tell them that I'm going to send you a messenger. And if you follow him, then paradise is yours. And if you disobey him, then it's the hellfire. And so remember, they're in a certain state where they can see it all. Like those realities that we're talking about the afterlife and all that. So they're seeing all of it. So God then sends them a messenger. And the messenger says, follow me. And he walks into fire. And the people that follow him find that the fire doesn't burn them. And they then enter paradise. And the people that reject him will find that they end up in the true fire, which is the hellfire. So the point is that Allah or God is maximally just, right? And that's one of the names and attributes of God. So we don't say that things are outside the justice of God. So a person doesn't know, they'll be held accountable for what they know, not about what they don't know. And again, this narration kind of shows us that in at least these categories, we see an example of that justice, right? So I don't know if that kind of covered the question. All right, next question. Does God give extra reward to those he gives significant suffering in this dunya, in this world? Some people are lucky and they are born into a family that teaches them to love Islam. Others who face abuse, violence, hunger, oppression clearly have their iman, their faith being tested more. So the answer is yes, there is extra reward for extra pain, right? In fact, and that was, again, that laundry list of wisdoms, one of them that I didn't mention, was a narration of the Prophet Muhammad, that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he mentions that even the pricking of a thorn, like if a thorn pricks a person, that the person will be forgiven for some of their sins. All right? So from an Islamic kind of theological framework, the human being is not perfect, obviously, right? And the human beings will have ups and downs. So sometimes they will be very close to God, and sometimes they will be far from God. Sometimes they will be very pious, and sometimes they're going to sin, right? And the thing is that in order to enter paradise, a person has to have a type of spiritual purity. Now that spiritual purity is attained either through repentance, where you ask God sincerely to forgive you, or it's attained by God wiping away certain sins in the form of certain types of sufferings a person may go through. So for instance, let me just extend it. Or a person, let's say, that they were in this life and they went through some suffering, but they still have a lot of sin on them. Then it's the pangs of death, because there's suffering when a person dies, that wipes away some of their sins. If that's not enough, then their time in the grave, which is, horrible, then that wipes away their sins. If not even that, then whether, if they're, they enter the hellfire to purify them, right, for a certain time. Now the point is that a person would prefer going through suffering now than entering the hellfire, obviously, right? And so any sort of suffering the person goes through, whether that's physical suffering, mental anguish. In fact, Imam al-Ghazali mentions the idea of even depression being one of those things that a person suffers from, that God would wipe away some of their sins, right? And so the idea is that there is reward in the sense that your sins are being wiped away when the person goes through some sort of calamity or some sort of suffering, right? And God knows best. All right, why do we need to worship God? How is Islam different from other religions? What are different kinds of worship? Not prayer, fasting, zakat. Okay, why do we need to worship God? For the sole reason that that's what you were created to do. And your true essence, remember we said, who are you? Your true essence has this connection with the one that created you. You know, they give a really interesting example that, remember we said that God blew into the human being the soul, right? Now obviously we're not saying that a piece of God is in every human being. I want to make sure that's very clear, that the creator and the creation are completely separate, right? But what is there is that there is some sort of a divine link or some sort of divine connection that you do have, that you recognize when you experience things like awe and things like that. And someone said that it's like comparing the sun with the sun rays. Like the sun is not the same as sun rays, and yet there is some sort of connection. And what happens is sometimes something can come in the way of that connection, right? Whether it's whatever it might be, but it doesn't stop there being the idea that it's connected in some way, some shape, or some form. Now, in order for the human being to really come to the highest spiritual excellence, it has to be in worshiping the one that gave him that spirituality, that spirit himself, right? So therefore, when we say, why do we need to worship God? The opposite recourse will leave a person completely helpless, right? And you see this a lot when people talk about, spirituality and, I'm a spiritual person, this and that. Well, why are you a spiritual person? If all we have is this material existence, right? That our existence is just based on random, blind, non-rational, non-intentional, physical processes. And if that's all there is, then where does this whole concept of you being a spiritual person come up in reality? Because in the sense, you're just an accident, right? Your brain function, even that is just random shootings of neurons, and it's just random. In fact, for those of you, there's a famous author, speaker, Yuval Harari. Have you heard of him? He wrote a book called *Sapiens*, and he actually opines that human beings don't have free will. He says because all we are just the workings of the neurological workings of the brain, and because they're random, they came from a random source, they're random, non-rational, non-intentional, that the source of that, and so therefore, any sort of reality that you perceive, or that free choice that you perceive to lift a bottle, whatever it might be, in fact isn't. It's just random occurrences. But the reality is, all of us experience free choice. Like you can choose to get up and leave right now if you want, right? So, the thing is, why do we need to worship God? It's because it takes us back to our true nature and our true state, and that is the spiritual beings that we are, to connect with the creator of the heavens and the earth. How is Islam different from other religions? Let me just be blunt here. Islam, what we say is that Islam is not new. Islam started with the Prophet Adam, and it was the message that every single prophet came with, whether it was Noah, Jesus, John the Baptist, whoever it may be. Because when you think about what Islam means, the word Islam means to submit, to surrender, to be obedient, to be sincere, and through all of that, entering into a state of peace. So sometimes we ask people like, okay, so what does Islam mean? They say, it means peace, right? I mean, kind of. But the thing is, there's a little bit more to it. So the term Islam, to surrender, to submit, to be obedient, to be sincere in that obedience, and to reach a state of peace, that's what the word Islam means. Now, when we say that all the prophets came with this message, they came with this message to remind the human being of their true nature, and that their purpose in this life is all of that, to surrender, to submit, to be obedient, to love God, and so on and so forth. In fact, I was speaking with a gentleman today, and I said, by extension, we say that all of the prophets and messengers, some of the ones I mentioned and some of the ones that you know of, were in fact all Muslims. You might be like, wait a minute, what? You mean they're a bunch of terrorists? What are you talking about, right? What do you mean? Well, I mean, like in English, when you have an action and you want to signify a person doing that action, you had an ER to the end of the word, right? So someone that drives a car is a, help me out here, driver. Someone that travels is a, someone that stinks is a, okay, you get the point, right? In the Arabic language, from one perspective, when you want to signify a doer of an action, you can add an MU to the beginning of the word. So the word for traveling in Arabic is safa. And I believe the English word safari comes from that word. So someone that's traveling, someone that's going through safar, is not suffering, but suffer, right, is a musafir or a musafir, right? The call to prayer that you may hear if you ever visit a mosque, right, the adhan, right? The one that does the adhan is a adhan muadhin. So Islam, the one that surrenders, submits, is obedient, is sincere. The one who does that is a Islam or a Muslim. And so therefore we say that even from, so when the question is, how is Islam different from other religions? We say that Islam is the truth. It was from the very beginning, and it was in any single time that it came. And over time, when Islam came to a certain group of people or a certain community, it was never meant to be a worldwide phenomenon until the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? And so therefore, that religion for a certain time in a certain place for certain people, in the wisdom of God, why he did that, right? And there's certain theories that a lot of scholars have come up with related to that, which I don't really have the time to expound upon. But the reality is that what we find in terms of religions today, at least those that claim belief in prophets and messengers, they are a type of distortion from that true message, right? Which is to surrender to God, that God is not man and man is not God, right? That worship and devotion is for God alone and not to anything he created, right? It's solely due to the one that put you here, the one that created you, and the one you're going to return back to. All right, what are different kinds of worship? Well, aside from prayer and fasting and zakat, these are like bodily things. But when we're talking, there's also worships of the heart. To just sit and remember God is in fact an act of worship, because it's an act of obedience. To be obedient to God is in fact an act of worship. And all of that has to do with this concept of having a pure intention, seeking the pleasure of God, right? So some scholars give the example that, you could go to the grocery store and buy some groceries for your family, and if your intention is solely because, God, you have entrusted me with my family to take care of them, and I'm doing this only for your sake, that then becomes an act of worship. Do you know what I'm saying? But if you go in kind of heedless and just be like, let me just grab some Cheez-Its and you're gone, right? Then maybe not. Right? So it's all about having that connection with the one that gave you your true self, right? And that's God Almighty. I think that was the last question.
We do have we have 3 questions, but they're quite similar, so I'm going to group them together. Can everyone hear me in the back? I'm just going to explain to the speaker here what the questions are. But so we've been speaking about God's justice, and how he encapsulates ultimate justice. So why then do we have situations where a bad and criminal type of Muslim may go to heaven, but a good-standing non-believer would not go to heaven? And similarly, along those lines, if God loves everyone, why choose to guide some people but not guide others? Where is the justice in that?
Okay. So let me kind of tackle the first one. And then repeat the first one again real quick.
Why can you have a situation where you have a Muslim who believes in God but is a criminal or a sinner, be entered into paradise, but you could have a non-believer that does good things, give charity, and so on and so forth, and they would not enter paradise? Or is that even the case to be?
Sure. Okay. So this comes down to the question of what is good and what is not good. What is good and what is evil. Okay. And so when we think of what is truly good, there are certain things that we understand that are, we can say, like objectively moral, right? As opposed to being subjectively moral. All right? Now just hang on, just stay with me for a second. So imagine now that I told you, or that you turn on the TV and you see a news report and it says, man beheads 1-year-old. Is that evil?
Yes.
It is. Okay. Is it objectively evil? Meaning, if the whole world came together and said that that's okay, does it make it okay? It doesn't, right? Or let me give you just another example. Let's say someone comes and asks you your opinion on rape. Is rape immoral? Is it objectively immoral? Meaning, if the whole world came together and said that rape is okay, would it be okay? No. Okay. So if that's the case, Why? What gives that, what's the ontological root, the moral anchor to say this is objectively immoral? What we say is that morality, to be something to be objectively moral, you have to have God in the picture. Because it is through God that you define what is moral and what is immoral in an objective sense. And I'm not saying there's no subjective morals or subjective things that are immoral. But if we claim directly that there are things that are objectively immoral or objectively immoral, then you have to say that that comes from God. Or you have to give an alternative. Say biology, but again that becomes subjective. If you say it's society, but that's also subjective, right? Think of Hitler. I mean, whatever it is. So if we say that there are things that are objectively immoral or objectively moral, then you have to say there's God. And then therefore, the question of morality, we have to place certain things in the realm of God. So when we say what is objectively immoral, what is the most immoral thing that you could do from the perspective of God, it is what's known as shirk, or assigning partners, or disbelieving in God, right? Now we might not see it like that, say, wait a minute, this guy was charitable, he was this and this and this, but the reality is, who defines what is truly good, objectively good, and what is objectively evil, right? So from that perspective, a person that has consciously rejected God, in other words, he has all the facts. This is not someone who's ignorant, obviously. Someone that has all the facts and is just obstinate and says, you know what? I don't want someone to tell me what to do. Why should I submit to anyone? Forget it. I'm going to reject God. That's a different context. So when the questioner asks, like, why would someone who's done a lot of good works that they're in the hellfire, whereas someone who's a criminal, right? Not that the criminal won't be accountable for the works that he did, but yes, if at least he had the idea that I believe in God and that my purpose in life is to worship God alone, right? Not worship anything else, myself or another human being, whatever it might be, and that according to the one that gives us objective standards for morality, then obviously that person would be deserving of paradise. Yes, he might do one of the worst things you can possibly imagine, but what you can possibly imagine. So it's a very different context. But once we understand that God has the knowledge, the totality of moral knowledge, and He's the standard, He's al-Bar, He is good, He is the good and the source of all goodness. He is as-Salam, He is the peace and the one that's the source of all peace, and so on. So if He's the standard, if God is the standard, then how exactly can we now put the question as it's placed and then expect, like, hold on a second, I'm going to judge what is truly good and what is truly evil. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed if you take God out of the picture in that scenario. All right, was there another one? Or?
That encapsulates it.
Okay, all right, are we done?
Yeah, I think we'll call it a wrap here.
Right.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, your attendance. I hope you found this enlightening and you were able to walk away from this lecture taking a little bit more about Islam with you. Before we wrap up, we do have some, prize, which is going to be drawn. And do I get to be that person who steals someone's prize or not? I guess so. All right. Alright, so the rules of the game are, if I call your name, I guess you win something, and you have to be here. So, I should. Alright. Was that fairly drawn? Everyone agree? Okay. Do we have a Philip LeBlanc? Wow. Wow. You, my friend, have won a $25 gift card to Amazon.ca, which I think is speech. Pretty cool, given how many Muslims are in here that we had Philip win. Pretty cool. All right, so we hope you come out to that. And you guys all saw that was fair. That was all fair. I didn't do anything. I'm just saying, signs.
How much you paid, man? Less than 25, I hope.
Once again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It was a pleasure having you. It'd be great to see you come out to the rest of the programs. Again, we have lectures taking place throughout the week. Gifts of Life taking place with Hamza Sources tomorrow, drawing from Muhammad on the day after, which is Thursday, and Total Knockoff on Friday. But again, this is the first day and the last day that we'll be with our speaker, Fahad Tasleem. So on behalf of the Muslim Students Association, we wanted to extend our appreciation in just a small token of how grateful we are, just a small gift. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a safe drive home. I know it's snowing out there, and we hope to see you guys throughout the week. Bye.